Have you ever felt time simply break? Not passing slower or faster, but to break it's as if something went off kilter for a few seconds, or minutes, and when you realize it, you can't quite explain what happened in that interval. A moment when everything seemed too slow, almost in slow motion, or the opposite, when hours disappeared as if they never existed. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me because what you're about to discover might surprise you. This strange sensation of distorted time isn't as rare as it seems. In fact, many people have experienced something similar in situations of stress, fear, extreme fatigue, deep anxiety, or even during moments of intense focus. And the most intriguing thing is that, when this happens, the sensation is real. It's not an exaggeration, it's not imagination, it's not all in your head in the common sense of the expression. It's literally your brain functioning outside its usual pattern. The curious thing is that, despite fully trusting our perception of time, the brain doesn't measure time like a clock measures seconds. It constructs this sensation from internal processes, combining attention, memory, emotion, and interpretation of reality. When all of this is in balance, time seems to flow normally. But just a small misalignment is enough for the perception of time to begin to distort, and that's when these disconcerting experiences arise. Perhaps you've already experienced this without even realizing it. That moment when you look at the clock and wonder, how is it that all this time has passed already? Or when an intense event seemed to last an eternity, even though it was quick. In extreme situations, some people report true temporal blackouts, lapses in which they can't tell how much time has passed. Have you ever experienced this? These strange brain phenomena often appear when the brain enters a different mode of operation. Under pressure, the brain prioritizes survival, rapid reaction, and interpreting threats. In this process, the notion of time ceases to be a stable reference and becomes something flexible, almost malleable. It's as if the brain rewrites the experience of time in real time without warning us. And that's exactly what makes this experience so unsettling. Because if the brain can fail to perceive time, what else can it distort without us realizing it? The sensation of continuous reality, of beginning, middle, and end, depends more on the brain than we imagine. When it fails, reality doesn't disappear, it just ceases to make sense for a few moments. Throughout this video, we'll explore why this happens, what happens inside the brain during these moments, and why time distortion is one of the clearest signs that our perception isn't as reliable as we like to believe. Stick with me until the end because understanding how the brain creates, and sometimes breaks, the notion of time completely changes how you view these strange experiences. And now, before we delve any deeper, think for a moment. How many times have you trusted the clock, without realizing that what truly controls the time you perceive isn't the clock, but something far more complex happening within your mind? It's precisely from this point that this story begins to get even more interesting. And if, at any point in this video, something I said triggered a memory, a strange feeling, or even a silent shiver on your part, it's worth paying attention to. Because these experiences aren't isolated, they say a lot about how the human brain works when it's not on autopilot. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what touched you most or if you've ever experienced a moment where time seemed distorted. Sometimes, putting it into words helps to better understand what was felt, and your experience can help other people who have also gone through something similar. While you listen to all this, think about it. How many times have you felt that something was wrong with time, but simply moved on as if it were too normal to question? Liking this video is a simple way of saying that this type of reflection matters, that it makes a difference to explore the mysteries of the brain more deeply and with fewer ready-made answers. This gesture helps the content reach more people who, perhaps right now, are trying to understand sensations they've never been able to explain. And if you enjoy this kind of conversation, one that blends science, mystery, and things everyone feels but almost no one talks about, subscribing to the channel is a way to continue this journey with me. Here, every video exists because there are curious people on the other side, questioning and wanting to go beyond the obvious. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, creating a community that doesn't ignore these strange flaws of the brain, but tries to understand them. And now that you've realized that the feeling of time isn't as solid as it seems, it's worth moving forward. Because understanding how the brain does this requires looking even more closely at the invisible mechanisms that operate behind the scenes of the mind. And that's exactly where things start to get even more surprising. When we talk about time, almost everyone thinks of something fixed, stable, almost untouchable. A second is a second, a minute is a minute, and that's it. The clock ticks, the calendar moves forward, and there's a comfortable feeling that time is a continuous, predictable line, the same for everyone. But that's only the external version of the story. Internally, in the brain, time doesn't work that way. It's not measured. It is built. The human brain doesn't have a precise internal clock, ticking like a stopwatch hidden inside the head. What it does is much more complex, and much more fragile. The sensation of time arises from the combination of several processes happening simultaneously: attention, emotions, memory, expectation, physical state, alertness level, mental load. The time you feel is not real time. It's the time the brain manages to organize while trying to make sense of what's happening. And this completely changes how we understand these experiences where time seems distorted. When you feel that everything has become too slow or too fast, it's not the world that has changed. It's how the brain is processing reality at that moment. Time, in this sense, is more of a narrative than a measurement. The brain constantly works behind the scenes, editing life's experience. It decides what deserves attention, what can be ignored, what needs to be remembered, and what can be forgotten. Time fits into this process. It is not perceived directly, but inferred from the amount of information processed and recorded. The more stimuli, the more dense time seems. The fewer relevant stimuli, the more it seems to slip through our fingers. That's why emotionally intense moments seem to expand. Situations of fear, risk, surprise, or anxiety cause the brain to enter a state of heightened alertness. In this mode, it captures more details, expands perception, and registers more information. When all of this is reorganized afterward, the feeling is that that instant lasted much longer than it actually did. Time didn't stretch. It's the memory that became more saturated. On the other hand, when we are in automatic mode, repeating routines, distracted, or excessively focused on something specific, the brain registers fewer temporal milestones. Little novelty, little emotion, little variation. The result is that, looking back, it seems that time has simply disappeared. Hours pass without leaving clear traces in memory. Not because time ran faster, but because there were almost not enough records to mark its passage. There's another somewhat unintuitive detail in all of this. The brain doesn't construct the sensation of time in real time. There's always a slight delay. It uses fragments of immediate memory to assemble the impression of continuity. The now you feel has already undergone silent editing. A quick montage, done so that reality seems coherent, fluid, logical. While this mechanism works well, nobody notices. But when the brain is overloaded, tired, stressed, or emotionally pressured, this construct begins to fail. And that's when strange sensations arise. Lapses, temporal holes, moments when you don't know exactly how much time has passed, or you feel that something has gone out of the natural rhythm of life. Time distortion, therefore, is not an isolated error. It is a signal. An indication that the brain has entered a different operating mode than usual. Sometimes this happens as part of an adaptation mechanism. Other times, it is simply a reflection of a mind pushed beyond its limits, trying to keep everything running at the same time. What's most intriguing is that these flaws rarely make us question our own perception. We feel the strangeness, perhaps a passing discomfort, and move on. We file the experience away in some confused corner of our memory and continue life as if nothing had happened. Few people stop to think about the impact this has on decisions, mindset, judgments, and interpretations of reality. Because if the brain can distort something as fundamental as time, what else might it be adjusting without us realizing it? How many decisions are made based on an altered perception? How many conclusions seem absolute, but were built on an unstable foundation? There is a hidden truth there, operating behind the scenes of the mind, shaping how we live our own journey. This discussion isn't about something rare or extreme. We're not talking about clinical exceptions or unusual situations. We're talking about the everyday functioning of the human brain. A powerful, yet imperfect, system that creates shortcuts, adaptations, and interpretations to cope with the complexity of life. And sometimes, these adjustments produce sensations so strange they seem almost unreal. The distortion of time reveals something profound. The reality we experience is not a faithful copy of the external world, but an internal construct. A silent agreement between the brain and experience. When this agreement becomes unbalanced, even for a moment, what we feel is this subtle break, this sensation that something no longer fits. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding that time is a mental construct is only the beginning. From here, it's necessary to look more closely at what happens when different brain systems come into conflict, when internal synchronicity is lost, and perception begins to fragment in even more unsettling ways. Before we continue, if any of this resonated with you in any way, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. When the brain goes into failure mode, what happens isn't a visible collapse, nor something that makes the person shut down immediately. Most of the time, everything continues to function externally. You talk, walk, respond, make decisions. But internally, something begins to lose the fine-tuned alignment that keeps the experience stable. It's like an orchestra that continues playing, but with instruments coming in out of time. The sound is still there, the music continues, but something no longer fits together as before. The brain relies on a delicate synchronicity between various systems to create a sense of continuity. Attention, memory, emotion, and perception need to operate in harmony. When one of these elements begins to pull in a different direction, whether due to overload, fatigue, or stress, the brain needs to prioritize. And every time it prioritizes, something else gets left out. Often, time is the first victim of this silent adjustment. Under prolonged stress, for example, the brain begins to function in a constant state of alert. It interprets the environment as something that demands a quick response, even when there is no immediate danger. In this state, focus narrows, the mind becomes more reactive and less contemplative. The brain is not interested in marking the passage of time, it is interested in solving, reacting, surviving. The result is a distorted perception, in which minutes seem to drag on or, paradoxically, disappear without leaving clear traces. Mental fatigue further deepens this effect. When the brain is tired, it loses efficiency in integrating information. Attention becomes fragmented, short-term memory weakens, and experience ceases to be recorded continuously. Instead of a fluid line, the day begins to be perceived as a sequence of cuts. Later, when trying to reconstruct what happened, the brain finds gaps. And these gaps manifest as the sensation of broken, flawed, irregular time. Fear introduces a different kind of distortion. When the brain perceives a threat, real or imagined, it activates older, more emotional circuits. Logic gives way to urgency. The body enters a state of alert, the senses intensify, and the volume of information processed increases dramatically. In a few seconds, the brain collects more data than it would in normal minutes. When this experience is organized later, it seems long, dense, almost artificially stretched. There is also the other side of this coin, hyperfocus. When the brain becomes deeply fixated on a task, idea, or stimulus, everything else becomes irrelevant. The environment disappears, the body becomes secondary, and time ceases to be monitored. There is no conscious counting, no clear milestones. When a person emerges from this state, the sensation is that time has evaporated. Hours have passed without warning, without detailed memory, without perceptible transition. The most important point here is to understand that the brain doesn't get wrong about time by accident. It gets the count wrong because it's too busy trying to keep other things running. Time distortion is a side effect of internal choices the brain makes all the time. Choices involving prioritization, energy conservation, adaptation, and survival. It's an automatic, invisible process that happens behind the scenes of the mind. And this has a profound impact on how we live our own journey. When time becomes distorted, emotions also become distorted. Problems seem bigger, sensations seem more lasting, decisions take on exaggerated weight. Something that could be fleeting transforms into something that seems permanent. Not because it is, but because it was experienced in an altered brain state. There is a hidden truth in this process that we rarely confront. Our sense of control is much less than we like to believe. Much of what we call reality is a construct adjusted in real time by the brain, based on the internal state of the moment. When this state is unbalanced, the perceived reality also becomes unbalanced. Throughout life, the brain makes hundreds of micro-adjustments to keep everything functioning. Most of the time this goes unnoticed. But when these adjustments accumulate, constant stress, prolonged fatigue, excessive stimuli, emotional pressure, the system begins to operate at its limit. And time once again reveals this overload. It loses regularity, loses coherence, loses predictability. Time distortion in this sense is not just a curious phenomenon. It is a sign of internal transformation. An indicator that something has changed in the way the brain is dealing with the world. And understanding this changes the mindset with which we look at these experiences. Instead of seeing them as something strange or frightening, we begin to see them as clues. Silent revelations about the state of mind. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when these systems come into conflict, the brain not only distorts time, it begins to alter the way it organizes reality as a whole. It is at this point that even more subtle, even more unsettling effects emerge, which help explain why at certain times, life seems to completely deviate from its expected rhythm. Before moving on, if any of this resonated with you, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. There are moments in life when time seems to obey completely different rules than those we know. A sudden fright, a near accident, a situation of real or perceived risk, and suddenly everything slows down. Sounds become clearer, movements seem longer, thoughts arise in rapid sequence, as if the brain were operating at an amplified frequency. Many people describe these moments as if they were watching their own lives in slow motion. And this sensation is neither poetic nor exaggerated. It reveals something profound about how the brain reacts to intensity. When we are exposed to an intense situation, the brain enters a state of maximum alert. It understands that something important is happening and that decisions need to be made quickly. In this state, emotions take priority, the body releases substances that increase focus, and the senses become sharper. The brain begins to register far more detail than in a normal situation. Every sound, every movement, every change in the environment is captured more intensely. Time, in this context, doesn't truly lengthen. What expands is the amount of information processed in a few seconds. After everything passes, the brain organizes this experience in memory. And because there were many records, many details, the memory seems to occupy more space. When we look back, the feeling is that that moment lasted much longer than it actually did. Time seems stretched because the memory is loaded. It's a powerful effect, giving the impression that the world slowed down to give us time to react. Anxiety works in a similar, though less obvious, way. When we are anxious, the brain lives in constant anticipation. It tries to predict scenarios, imagine risks, and prepare responses. This prolonged state of alertness causes the perception of time to change. Simple moments can seem too long, conversations drag on, and waiting becomes almost unbearable. Not because time has changed, but because the brain is trapped in an internal cycle of vigilance and expectation. Conversely, there's the other side of this distortion, when time seems to simply disappear. Repetitive routines, automatic tasks, days that are very similar to each other. In these situations, the brain understands that there isn't enough novelty to justify a detailed record. It saves energy, reduces the level of attention, and lets the body continue on autopilot. Few milestones are created, few memories are formed clearly. When we look back, the result is a feeling of temporal emptiness. Days, weeks, or even months seem to have passed too quickly. Not because they passed faster, but because they left almost no trace in our memory. Without significant events, without emotion, without variation, the brain does not construct a rich narrative of the time lived. And without a narrative, time seems to have been swallowed up. This explains why intense periods of life often seem long and dense, while repetitive phases seem short and diffuse. A year full of changes, challenges, and emotions is usually remembered as long. A year of rigid routine, even if it lasted the same 12 months, seems to have passed in the blink of an eye. Emotional impact creates volume in memory. Repetition creates emptiness. These distortions reveal something important about our mindset towards life. The brain doesn't value time in an abstract way. It values meaning. Where there is impact, there is a record. Where there is transformation, there is memory. Where everything repeats itself, time loses relevance. This influences not only how we remember the past, but how we feel the present and how we project the future. Decisions made in moments of intensity tend to carry more weight. They seem definitive, full of truth, as if they reveal something profound about who we are. Decisions made automatically, on the other hand, tend to be forgotten, diluted in routine. The emotional state in which we live shapes the importance we give to each moment, and this directly alters how time is perceived. There's a hidden truth in this process. The time we perceive is a direct reflection of our relationship with the experience. It's not the clock that defines the impact of a moment, but how present the brain was in it. The more involvement, the longer it seems. The less presence, the faster it disappears. Upon realizing this, many people begin to reevaluate their own journey. They start to question why certain periods seem empty, while others seem too dense. They begin to understand that the feeling of wasted time or time dragging on is not a personal flaw, but a natural effect of how the brain responds to intensity and repetition. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we understand why time stretches or shrinks in intense situations, we begin to see something even more delicate happening behind the scenes of the mind. There is a more subtle layer where memory, emotion, and perception mix in ways that alter not only time, but the very sensation of reality. It is at this point that the revelations become even more disconcerting. If all of this made sense to you on any level, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. When we talk about attention and memory, we enter the heart of the mechanism that makes time seem elastic, unstable, sometimes even deceptive. Because, fundamentally, the brain doesn't measure time by counting seconds. It measures time by counting experiences. Every detail perceived, every emotion felt, every thought activated becomes an internal marker. And it is the sum of these markers that builds the sensation of duration. Attention functions like a spotlight. What it illuminates gains importance, depth, and is recorded. What falls outside this focus simply passes by without leaving clear traces. When attention is scattered, the brain collects little relevant information. When it is intensely active, the brain begins to register far more details from the same time interval. And it is precisely there that perception begins to transform. Imagine two moments with the same objective duration. In one, you are fully attentive, emotionally involved, perceiving sounds, expressions, thoughts, and physical sensations. In the other, you are distracted, on autopilot, repeating a familiar pattern. To the clock, both last the same amount of time. To the brain, they are completely different. The first becomes dense, heavy, full of content. The second almost doesn't exist in memory. This happens because memory is not a neutral archive of reality. It is selective, economical, and highly influenced by attention. The brain registers what it considers relevant for learning, adaptation, or survival. The more stimuli it processes in a short interval, the more material it has to organize later. And, in organizing this material, the feeling arises that that moment was long. That's why, after an intense experience, many people say things like, "It felt like it lasted an eternity." It's not just a figure of speech. It's a sincere reading of the brain when revisiting a memory full of details. A full memory creates the illusion of extended time. An empty memory, on the other hand, creates the opposite illusion: compressed time, almost non-existent. There's an even more subtle detail in this process. The brain doesn't store time itself, but the sequence of events. When there are many distinct events, the sequence becomes long. When there is repetition, the sequence shortens. Repetitive routines generate similar memories, which end up overlapping. When looking back, the brain has difficulty differentiating one day from another. The result is the feeling that everything passed too quickly. This has a profound impact on how we experience our own life journey. Phases full of change, challenges, discoveries, and emotions are often remembered as long, transformative, and significant. Periods of stagnation, even comfortable ones, tend to fade from memory easily. Not because they weren't important, but because they didn't generate enough attention to create distinct memories. Attention also defines the emotional weight of a moment. When we are attentive, we feel more. When we feel more, we remember more. And when we remember more, time seems longer. This simple chain explains why certain short moments completely change the way we perceive the past. A single intense event can occupy more space in memory than entire months of routine. There is a hidden truth in all of this. The time we experience afterward is always a reconstruction. It is not lived twice in the same way. First, it is lived with varying degrees of attention. Then, it is remembered based on what was recorded. In between, the brain makes silent choices about what deserves to remain. And these choices shape our perception of reality. This influences decisions, mindset, and even identity. People who frequently experience intense moments often feel they are living a lot, even in less time. Those who spend long periods on autopilot may feel like life is slipping away. Not because it is, but because the brain isn't being fed enough new stimuli to create rich memories. What's most intriguing is realizing that this distortion doesn't only happen during big events. It happens all the time in small doses. A meaningful conversation can seem long and memorable. An entire day without attention can disappear. The way you direct your attention silently redefines how time will be remembered. This reveals something important about personal transformation. Changing how we pay attention changes how we experience time. Not in a shallow motivational sense, but on a deep neurological level. Attention creates memory. Memory creates duration. Duration creates meaning. And meaning alters our perception of reality itself. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we begin to understand how attention and memory shape time, we are led to an even more delicate layer of mental functioning. A layer where the brain not only registers what happened, but actively reconstructs the experience, mixing memory, emotion, and interpretation. It is at this point that time ceases to be merely distorted and begins to be, in a way, reinvented. If all of this resonated with you in any way, write it in the comments. That makes sense to me. There are times when the distortion of time ceases to be merely strange and begins to seem almost supernatural. We're not just talking about that common feeling that the day went by too fast or that a scare lasted longer than it should have. Here we enter a more unsettling territory, where the very notion of continuity seems to break down. Lapses of time, small blackouts, intervals in which the person simply cannot explain what happened between one point and another in the experience. These moments often have a profound impact precisely because they shatter one of the most basic certainties of the human mind: the idea that we are always aware of the flow of our own lives. Suddenly, you realize you've arrived somewhere and can't remember the way. You look at the clock and wonder how that interval passed. You try to mentally reconstruct the events and find only silence. No clear image, no logical sequence. Just an uncomfortable emptiness. For those experiencing this, the sensation can be unsettling. There's a feeling that something switched off for a few minutes, as if the mind went offline. And it's at this point that many people begin to resort to mystical or supernatural explanations, because the experience is completely outside of what seems normal. The human mind has difficulty accepting flaws in its own perception, so it seeks meaning wherever possible. But, strange as it may seem, these lapses have quite clear neurological explanations. What happens most of the time is not a total absence of consciousness, but a failure in the registration of the experience. The brain continued functioning, the body continued moving, simple decisions continued to be made. What didn't happen was the proper recording of the memory of that period. When certain brain systems come into conflict, reduced attention, increased fatigue, prolonged stress, or emotional overload, the brain can enter a mode of extreme economy. It maintains only essential functions, failing to register details. The result is an experience lived without clear memory. And without memory, time seems to have disappeared. This creates a feeling of blackout. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing was properly stored. Time doesn't disappear the moment it's lived. It disappears afterward when we try to access it. It's a subtle but fundamental difference. The perception of lost time arises from the act of remembering, not from the act of living. In some cases, this sensation is accompanied by a slight detachment from reality, as if the world were somewhat out of focus. Sounds seem distant, movements seem automatic, the body acts almost reflexively. These states usually occur when the brain is dealing with more stimuli than it can consciously integrate. Instead of collapsing, it drastically simplifies the experience. There is a hidden truth in all of this that is rarely discussed. Continuous consciousness is, in practice, a functional illusion. The brain creates the sensation of continuity because it is useful, not because it is perfect. When the mechanisms that sustain this illusion fail, even momentarily, we feel this profound discomfort, this break in the personal narrative. And that's precisely what makes these episodes so striking. They not only distort time but threaten our sense of identity. After all, if I don't remember that interval, was it part of me? Did it really exist? These questions arise because our notion of self is intimately linked to memory and the continuity of experience. The emotional impact of these lapses is often greater than the cognitive impact. Many people report fear, confusion, or a vague feeling of loss of control. It's not the time itself that's frightening, but the idea that the mind can operate outside our field of consciousness without asking permission. This directly challenges the mindset of control that we like to maintain over ourselves. At the same time, understanding what is happening behind the scenes in the brain can be profoundly transformative. Realizing that these episodes are not supernatural failures, but responses of the nervous system to overload, completely changes how they are interpreted. The mystery doesn't disappear, but it takes on more human, more understandable contours. These experiments show that the brain is not a linear, predictable, always stable machine. It is adaptive, economical, and strategic. In extreme situations, it chooses what to keep and what to sacrifice. And often, it sacrifices conscious memory to preserve basic functioning. Time, once again, ends up being shaped by these invisible choices. Throughout life's journey, almost everyone experiences episodes like this, even if they don't realize it or don't give it importance. Small lapses, moments of autopilot, instants that simply leave no mark. What varies is the intensity and frequency. And it is precisely this variation that makes some episodes seem so out of the ordinary, so difficult to explain. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we look closely at these temporal blackouts, we begin to realize that they reveal something even more delicate about how the brain constructs the sensation of continuous reality. There is a silent, almost invisible mechanism that stitches together the fragments of experience so that life makes sense. When this stitching fails, even for moments, time ceases to be merely distorted and begins to seem almost unrecognizable. If this part of the conversation resonated with you in any way, write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. When we begin to put all these pieces together, the distortion of time, the lapses, the blackouts, the influence of attention, emotion, and memory, an inevitable, almost uncomfortable question arises. If the brain can err on something as basic as the passage of time, how much can it err on the subject of reality itself? This question is uncomfortable because it touches on a silent belief that almost everyone carries. the idea that, despite everything, what we perceive is reliable. The hidden truth is that the reality we experience is not the world itself, but a continuous interpretation made by the brain. Time, in this sense, acts as a kind of invisible glue that holds everything together. It gives sequence, coherence, beginning, middle, and end to experiences. When this glue fails, even for moments, something much bigger begins to waver, the feeling that life is stable and predictable. The distortion of time reveals that the brain is not a faithful mirror of the world. It is an active constructor of meaning. It decides what goes in, what stays out, what gets highlighted, and what is discarded. And it does all this behind the scenes without conscious permission. Time is just one element of this construction, perhaps the most noticeable when something goes wrong. When a person realizes they've lost minutes, hours, or that an intense moment seemed eternal, it's not just time that's at stake. It's their trust in their own experience. A slight existential discomfort arises, a feeling difficult to name, as if the ground has become a little less solid. After all, if the mind can reorganize time in this way, what guarantees that other perceptions aren't being adjusted in the same manner? This fragility of reality is not usually perceived in everyday life because the brain is extremely efficient at hiding its own flaws. It creates a fluid, continuous narrative that makes everything seem logical after it has already happened. Even disconnected experiences are stitched together into a coherent story. We only notice the cracks when something deviates too much from the norm. And when that happens, the feeling isn't just strangeness. It's impact. It's a momentary breakdown of the control mentality. The idea that, I know what's happening, is shaken. The brain, which should be the ultimate arbiter of reality, begins to seem like an unreliable narrator. Not because it's deliberately deceiving us, but because it's doing the best it can with limited resources. There is something profoundly transformative in this realization. It forces us to rethink how we make decisions, how we judge situations, and how we interpret our own emotional reactions. How many absolute certainties were built in moments of perceptual distortion? How many conclusions seem like solid truths, but were born in mental states altered by stress, fear, or fatigue? The human journey is constantly marked by these micro-flaws. The difference is that we almost never stop to observe them. We prefer to believe that the problem lies in the world, in the circumstances, in the people around us. We rarely consider that the perceived reality itself may be undergoing invisible adjustments behind the scenes of the mind. When time becomes distorted, it acts as a silent warning. A reminder that what we feel as real is actually a filtered, edited, and organized version of raw experience. This doesn't mean everything is false or illusory, but it does mean that nothing is perceived in a completely neutral way. There is always a filter. There is always an interpretation. This understanding can generate discomfort, but it can also generate freedom. When we realize that reality is more flexible than it seems, we begin to question overly rigid certainties. We begin to realize that many anxieties are amplified by internal states, that many fears grow in size because they were experienced in moments of emotional and temporal distortion. The brain doesn't lie maliciously. It simplifies, adapts, adjusts. It creates a functional version of reality so that we can continue living, deciding, moving forward. The problem arises when we confuse this functional version with an absolute truth. The distortion of time exposes this confusion clearly, almost didactically. When we confront this fragility, something changes in the way we look at our own experiences. We begin to observe more, to react less automatically. We begin to understand that not every urgent feeling is definitive, that not every intense thought reflects a profound truth. Often, it simply reflects a brain trying to reorganize itself. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we begin to question the reliability of time, we are inevitably led to question other pillars of human experience: memory, identity, continuity, and even the sense of self. There is an even more delicate layer just below this perception, where reality ceases to be something given and becomes something constantly reconstructed. If all of this sparked some reflection in you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. When the conversation reaches this point, it's natural for a silent doubt to arise in the listener. To what extent is all this normal? After all, if time can be distorted, if lapses occur, if reality sometimes seems unstable, where is the line that separates a common human experience from something that deserves more attention? This question is important precisely because it brings the conversation back to a place of clarity and balance. The first thing that needs to be very clear is that most of these experiences are absolutely normal. Feeling time speed up, slow down, disappear at certain moments, or seem excessively long at others is part of the normal functioning of the human brain. This happens because the brain was not made to measure time with mathematical precision, but but to deal with meaning, survival, adaptation, and decision-making. Distortion in this sense is not a serious flaw, it is a byproduct of how the mind operates. Moments of stress, anxiety, fatigue, overstimulation, or even intense enthusiasm can generate these sensations without any major underlying problem. Small memory lapses in routine situations, inattention, or the feeling that the day disappeared, are experiences that practically everyone has lived through to some degree. They are part of the human journey in an increasingly fast-paced and demanding world. The brain is constantly trying to balance internal and external demands. When the load increases, it makes automatic adjustments to continue functioning. These adjustments can affect the perception of time, memory, and attention without necessarily indicating anything pathological. Most of the time, rest, reduced stimuli, a change of pace, or emotional reorganization are enough to get everything back on track. The point of concern arises when these experiences cease to be isolated incidents and become frequent, intense, or overly impactful. When a person begins to lose time repeatedly, when lapses become lengthy, or when the distortion interferes with their routine, decisions, work, or relationships, the brain may be signaling that something is not being processed properly. Not as a panic alarm, but as a request for adjustment. Prolonged emotional overload, chronic stress, sleep deprivation, and constant pressure can push the brain into a state of continuous, borderline functioning. In this state, compensatory mechanisms are used more frequently, and what was once rare begins to repeat itself. Time becomes fragmented, memory fails more often, and the sense of presence diminishes. This isn't because the person is losing control, but because the system is being pushed beyond its healthy limits. There is also the emotional impact of these experiences. When time distortion begins to generate constant fear, anxiety, or insecurity, it ceases to be merely a curious phenomenon and begins to affect a person's mentality. Excessive worry about lapses, a continuous feeling of strangeness, or the fear of switching off, can in themselves further fuel the problem, creating a cycle of tension and internal vigilance. That's why clarity is so important here. Understanding that the brain responds to internal states helps to take the weight off catastrophic interpretations. Not every distortion is a sign of something serious. Most of the time, it's a reflection of rhythm, lifestyle, emotional pressure, or excessive stimuli. The brain speaks through these experiences because that's how it signals imbalances. When observed carefully, these distortions can become allies. They act as indicators that something needs to change. More rest, less overload, more presence, more care for one's own mental and emotional journey. Instead of fear, they can generate awareness. Instead of panic, they can generate transformation. There's a hidden truth in this process that's rarely spoken clearly. The brain doesn't suddenly break down. It warns. It signals. It adjusts. Distortions in time, memory, and attention are part of this silent language. Ignoring them completely can lead to greater burnout. Understanding them can open the door to more conscious choices and decisions more aligned with one's own well-being. At the same time, it's important not to romanticize or dramatize these experiences. They don't define who a person is, nor do they determine their future. They are states, not identities. They pass, change, and reorganize. The brain has an enormous capacity for adaptation when given the right conditions. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding when these experiences are normal and when they deserve attention opens up something even more interesting. Understanding how the brain tries to protect and reorganize itself when it is overloaded. There is a set of silent mechanisms working to maintain balance, even when perception begins to fail. It is in these behind-the-scenes aspects that important clues emerge about how the human mind adjusts to continue functioning. If all of this made sense to you so far, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. When all of this starts to fall into place, it becomes impossible to look at time in the same way as before. The feeling that arises is not just scientific curiosity, but a silent shift in perspective. Because ultimately what we call time has never been on the clock. It has always been in the brain. The clock only marks an external rhythm. It is the mind that gives meaning to this rhythm, working all the time behind the scenes, interpreting, editing, and reconstructing each lived moment. The time we experience is not a straight line. It is an experience shaped by attention, emotion, memory, and internal state. It expands when something passes through us internally. It shrinks when life passes by on autopilot. It fails when the brain is overloaded. And this is not a rare error or an isolated defect. It is part of the normal functioning of a system that was not made to be perfect, but to be adaptable. There is something profoundly human in realizing this. The idea that the reality we experience, including time, is an active interpretation changes how we perceive our own experiences. Moments that seem too long may not have been emotional exaggerations, but intense mental states. Phases that seem to have disappeared may not have been wasted, but lived with little conscious presence. This reading brings a different kind of understanding, less judgment and more context. When the brain fails to perceive time, it's not betraying reality. It's trying to cope with information overload, emotional pressure, quick decisions, and constant adaptations. It does the best it can with the resources available at that moment. Sometimes this generates distortions. Sometimes it generates lapses. Sometimes it generates the uncomfortable feeling that something doesn't fit. But even in these failures there is logic. There is functional intention. There is survival. This realization has a direct impact on how we deal with ourselves. How many times do we criticize ourselves for feeling too much, for thinking something lasted too long, for feeling that life is passing by too quickly? How many decisions have been judged harshly without considering the mental state in which they were made? When we understand that the perceived time depends on the brain, we begin to see these situations with more kindness and less rigidity. The hidden truth is that we don't live in clock time. We live in the time of the mind. A subjective, changeable time, sensitive to what happens within us. And this explains why two people can experience the same event in completely different ways. Not because one is right and the other wrong, but because each brain has constructed that experience in its own way. This perception also changes the mindset with which we approach the journey itself. Instead of measuring life solely by the number of years or hours, we begin to realize the importance of the quality of attention, the emotional impact and presence. What marks the memory is not the objective duration, but the subjective intensity. This is what gives weight, meaning, and depth to the time lived. And perhaps the most disconcerting, and at the same time most liberating, aspect is accepting that reality has never been as solid as we imagined. It has always been a continuous construction. A narrative stitched together by the brain so that we can move forward, make choices, create meaning. When this narrative fails, even for a moment, we feel the strangeness. But we also gain the opportunity to see beyond the surface. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding that time resides in the brain opens the way to something even more delicate. Understanding how this interpretation of time influences identity, memory, and the feeling of who we are throughout life. When time fails, it's not just the internal clock that becomes misaligned, it's the very notion of continuity that begins to be questioned. Perhaps the phrase that will keep echoing after all this is simple but hard to ignore. The time you perceive is not the time that passes, it's the time that your brain is able to count. And sometimes, it miscounts not to confuse us but to keep functioning. If this reflection resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. And if you've made it this far, it makes sense to imagine that this topic has also been echoing inside you. So if you'd like, leave a simple phrase in the comments, something like, "This message was for me," or, "I'm with you until the end," just so I know this conversation reached you on the other side. If this content has helped you see time, the mind, or your own experience in a different way, subscribing to the channel is a way to continue exploring these mysteries together. The idea here is always to go beyond the surface and bring reflections that truly make a difference in how you think and feel. If at any point during this video you felt connected, identified with it, or was prompted to reflect, leaving a like is just a simple gesture of saying, "This made sense to me." This helps the channel continue to exist and bring this type of content to more curious people like you. Now, there's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic, delves even deeper into this conversation, and connects with everything we've discussed so far. Click there and continue reading.